Hey guys, tonight we step softly into a jungle that never really sleeps, where the air feels thick enough to sip, and every leaf seems to whisper secrets you're not entirely sure you want to hear. You push through vines that cling like overly affectionate houseplants, and just ahead, through the haze of green, a pool of still water glimmers. It looks peaceful, decorative, even the kind of place you'd sit beside with a coconut drink if coconuts were available and, if you'd survive long enough to enjoy one. Because here's the thing, you probably won't survive this. Not without understanding how the people who once lived here turned water itself into both an art form and a lifeline. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and local time. I always love seeing where in the world you're drifting off from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step closer to the pond, expecting murky stagnation, maybe a mosquito convention in full swing. But instead, the water is clear, suspiciously clear, the kind of clarity that makes you wonder if someone's been secretly maintaining it. Except the caretakers you're imagining have been gone for over 1,000 years. This is your first quiet hint that the ancient Maya weren't just builders of pyramids and calendar enthusiasts. They were masters of something far less flashy but infinitely more essential: clean water. Now, here's a mainstream historical fact to anchor your wandering thoughts. The Maya civilization, thriving roughly between 2000 BCE and the 16th century CE, built massive urban centers like Tikal deep within tropical forests. These cities supported tens of thousands of people, all of whom needed reliable water in an environment where rivers were inconveniently absent. You crouch beside the pond and dip your fingers in. Cool, refreshing, surprisingly inviting. And yet, nothing about this setting should make clean water easy. The soil beneath you is limestone, porous, thirsty, the kind that drinks rainwater faster than you can say hydration crisis. So how did they do it? Well, that's where things start to get quietly impressive, and a little strange, because what you're looking at isn't just a pond. It's a carefully engineered reservoir, designed not just to collect water, but to filter it. Yes, filter, as in remove impurities, as in something you probably rely on a Brita pitcher for, or at least hope your city handles for you. The Maya, without modern chemistry kits or instructional YouTube tutorials, figured out how to keep their water clean using layers of natural materials. Sand, gravel, and this is where it gets interesting, special minerals that could trap toxins and bacteria. You shift your weight, suddenly aware that this ornamental pond might actually be more sophisticated than your kitchen setup. And here comes a quirky tidbit that feels almost like a plot twist. Some of these filtration systems included zeolite, a volcanic mineral known today for its ability to purify water by removing harmful substances like ammonia and heavy metals. It's the kind of thing modern science uses in industrial filtration. And yet here it is, quietly doing its job centuries ago in the middle of a jungle. Historians still argue whether the Maya fully understood the chemical properties of these materials or simply observed that certain combinations made water taste better and caused fewer illnesses. Either way, the result is the same. Remarkably clean water in a place where that should have been nearly impossible. You stand up and glance around. The pond isn't alone. It's part of a network. Subtle channels, gentle slopes, all guiding rainwater into this space. It's almost like the city itself was designed to breathe water in, clean it, and hold on to it like a precious secret. And let's be honest, if you were living here, you'd treat clean water like gold too. Because in this environment, it basically was. You take a few steps along the edge, noticing how the pond is framed. Not randomly, but intentionally. The stones are placed with care, the edges shaped to prevent erosion. It's functional, yes, but also beautiful, which raises an interesting question. Why go through all this effort for something that could have just been a muddy hole? Well, the Maya didn't really do just muddy holes. Even their practical solutions had a flair for the dramatic. You pause and imagine the scene centuries ago. People gathering here, not just to drink but to reflect, to perform rituals, to exist in a space where survival and spirituality blurred together. Because for the Maya, water wasn't just a resource, it was sacred. And that's where this story starts to deepen. Because what you initially thought was a simple pond turns out to be a quiet intersection of science, art, and belief. A place where engineering meets mythology, and where every drop of water carries both practical value and symbolic weight. You glance down again, watching the surface ripple slightly as a leaf falls in. For a moment, it's easy to forget how much thought, effort, and ingenuity went into making this water safe. But then you remember, this clarity isn't accidental. It's the result of generations of observation, experimentation, and, let's face it, probably a few unfortunate trial-and-error moments that didn't end well for someone. Ancient R and Amp winking and laughing was less forgiving. Still, here you are, standing beside a system that quietly challenges the idea that advanced technology is purely a modern achievement. And as the jungle hums around you, you begin to realize that this pond is just the beginning. A single piece of a much larger puzzle. One that stretches across cities, across centuries, and deep into the minds of the people who built it. Because if they could turn a simple pond into a filtration system this effective, what else were they capable of? You take one last look at the water, now reflecting the dimming light through the canopy, and feel a strange sense of respect. Maybe even a little envy. After all, your tap water doesn't come with this kind of story. You linger by the water a moment longer, watching the surface settle as if it, too, is catching its breath. But something about this place feels intentional in a way that goes beyond engineering. The quiet isn't empty, it's expectant, as though the pond isn't just for drinking, but for something deeper, something that hums just beneath the surface. You straighten up, brushing a stray leaf from your arm, and begin to notice details you missed before. A carved stone nearby, subtle, worn, but unmistakably shaped by human hands. Patterns swirl across it, curves and symbols that seem to mimic the movement of water itself. Not decoration for decoration's sake, more like reverence, because for the Maya, water wasn't just a resource you stored. It was a force you respected. A quick, grounding fact: the Maya believed in a complex spiritual world where natural elements, especially water, were tied to powerful deities. Rain, in particular, was governed by Chak, a figure often depicted with a long nose and lightning axe, responsible for storms, fertility, and, quite literally, whether your crops lived or died. So when you look at this pond again, it's not just infrastructure. It's part of a relationship, a negotiation almost between humans and the forces that controlled their survival. You take a few slow steps along the edge, imagining how this space might have felt centuries ago. Not quiet like now, but alive. People gathering at dawn, the air filled with murmured prayers and the occasional splash. Maybe offerings placed gently into the water. Maybe a whispered request for rain that wasn't too much, not too little, just right. Ancient weather apps were, unfortunately, unreliable. And here's where things get interesting in a slightly unexpected way. The Maya didn't separate the practical from the spiritual the way modern societies often do. For them, building a water reservoir wasn't just about storage, it was about honoring the forces that made that water possible. Which means this filtration system you're admiring, it wasn't just clever, it was sacred. You glance at the edges again, noticing how clean and orderly everything feels. Not sterile, but cared for, maintained. Because if water was tied to divine favor, then keeping it pure wasn't just good hygiene, it was a form of respect. Now, here's a quirky tidbit that might catch you off guard. Some Maya rituals involved placing objects like jade, pottery, or even small figurines into water sources as offerings. Jade, in particular, was associated with life and breath. So dropping a piece into a reservoir wasn't just a gift, it was symbolic of sustaining life itself. Imagine tossing your most valuable jewelry into your water supply today and calling it a good idea. Different priorities, clearly. Historians still argue whether these offerings had any perceived, purifying effect in the minds of the Maya, or if they were purely symbolic gestures meant to maintain favor with the gods. Either way, it adds another layer to what you're seeing here. A system that's as much about belief as it is about biology. You pause, listening. The jungle is never silent, but there's a rhythm to it, a kind of natural pulse. And it's not hard to imagine how the Maya would have seen this environment as alive, responsive, even communicative. Water, especially, would have felt like a messenger. Rain falling from the sky, disappearing into the earth, reappearing in reservoirs like this one. A cycle that wasn't just physical but spiritual. You crouch again, this time noticing how the bottom of the pond slopes gently. Subtle but deliberate. Sediment would settle in certain areas, making it easier to manage. Cleaner water would remain accessible. It's engineering, yes, but it also feels considerate. As if whoever designed this wasn't just solving a problem, but thinking about how people would interact with the solution daily. Where they'd stand, how they'd reach the water, how it would look. Because let's be honest, if you're going to rely on something for survival, it might as well be pleasant to look at. Ancient interior design, but for hydration. You take a step back and look at the broader layout. The pond isn't isolated, it's positioned in relation to other structures. Pathways lead toward it. Open spaces nearby suggest gatherings. This wasn't tucked away like a utility closet. It was central, visible, important. And that tells you something crucial. Water wasn't hidden. It was celebrated. Another small but fascinating detail. Some Maya reservoirs were lined with clay to prevent leakage, especially in areas where the porous limestone would otherwise drain them dry. This layering, clay, sand, gravel, and sometimes those special minerals, created a multi-stage filtration system that's surprisingly similar to modern techniques. Except here, it's all done with materials you could carry without needing a forklift. Or a user manual. You tilt your head slightly, imagining the process of building this. The planning, the labor, the coordination. It's not a small effort. It's a community project, likely overseen by individuals who understood both the physical and spiritual stakes. Because if this system failed, it wasn't just inconvenient. It was catastrophic. No pressure, right? You walk a little farther, and the pond begins to disappear behind foliage. But the feeling stays with you, that quiet sense that you've just seen something that operates on multiple levels at once. A place where survival meets symbolism, where science and belief aren't competing, but cooperating, and where every drop of water carries not just the promise of life, but the weight of expectation. You glance back one last time, the surface now reflecting fragments of sky through the canopy. It's beautiful, yes, but also purposeful. Every curve, every layer, every decision leading to this moment of stillness. And as you turn to move deeper into the city, you start to understand that this wasn't an isolated achievement. This was a pattern, a philosophy, a way of living that treated water not as something to conquer, but something to work with carefully, respectfully, and with just enough ingenuity to make it all look effortless. Which, of course, it absolutely wasn't. You leave the pond behind, though not entirely. Its quiet presence seems to follow you as you step deeper into the city. The jungle presses in again, thick and insistent, but now you start to notice something different. The ground beneath your feet isn't random. It slopes, just slightly, almost imperceptibly, but always with a purpose. You're not just walking through a forest. You're walking through a system, and that system is built around a problem that never quite goes away. Water that comes and goes on its own terms. You pause on a raised stone path, brushing aside a hanging vine, and the view opens just enough for you to see it. Structures rising above the canopy. Stepped silhouettes, weathered but unmistakable. One of them belongs to Calakmul, a vast ancient city that once rivaled the more famous Tikal. At its peak, Calakmul supported tens of thousands of people, all living in a place where, for half the year, rain either arrived in overwhelming abundance, or not at all. That's the first challenge you really start to feel here: unpredictability. In the wet season, the sky opens up like it's making up for lost time. Rain pours down, filling every depression, every channel, every reservoir. It's generous, almost too generous. But then, months later, the rains stop. Completely. The land dries out, the air thickens, and suddenly all that abundance feels like a distant memory. You shift your weight, imagining what that must have been like, knowing that the water you collect now has to last. Not days, not weeks, months. No refills, no backup plan. Just whatever you manage to capture and keep clean. Here's a solid historical fact to anchor that thought. Many Maya cities had no permanent rivers or lakes nearby. Instead, they relied almost entirely on rainwater stored in reservoirs, often called aguadas. These weren't optional features, they were the backbone of urban life, which means every drop mattered. You continue walking, and the terrain subtly shifts again. You notice shallow depressions carved into the landscape, some lined with stone, others more natural but clearly shaped. These are catchment areas, places designed to guide rainwater into storage systems. It's like the entire city is gently funneling water toward a few key locations. You can't help but admire the foresight. It's not just about building a reservoir, it's about designing everything around it. Even the roads, especially the roads, because those raised stone paths you're walking on, they're not just there to keep your sandals dry during a downpour. They also help direct water flow, channeling rain into specific areas while preventing erosion. It's infrastructure doing double duty, quietly multitasking like a seasoned professional. Modern cities could take notes, and probably a nap afterward. Now, here's a quirky detail that feels almost poetic. Some Maya cities were so finely tuned to their environment that even slight variations in elevation, sometimes just a few centimeters, were used to control water movement. That's right, you're basically walking through a giant, ancient water management system that operates on gradients so subtle you'd miss them if you blinked. No laser levels, no GPS, just observation, patience, and a deep understanding of how water behaves. Historians still argue whether this level of precision was the result of centralized planning by elite engineers or a more gradual, community-driven process refined over generations. Either way, the result is the same. A city that doesn't fight its environment, it works with it. You step off the path briefly, your foot sinking slightly into softer ground, and immediately realize why the Maya elevated their walkways. Down here, during the rainy season, this would be a muddy mess. Not exactly ideal for daily life or dignity. You climb back onto the stone, silently thanking ancient engineers for their thoughtful design. As you move forward, the density of structures increases. Platforms, plazas, the occasional towering temple, all arranged in a way that feels intentional, even if you can't quite map it out in your head. And everywhere, if you look closely, there are signs of water management. Channels, slopes, subtle barriers. It's like the city is quietly whispering, "We planned for this." You stop near a broad open space, the ground slightly concave. During the rainy season, this might have held water temporarily, acting as a buffer before excess flowed into larger reservoirs. It's not flashy, no grand carvings or dramatic architecture, but it's essential, and that's something you're starting to appreciate more and more. The most important parts of this civilization aren't always the most visible. Sure, the pyramids get the attention. They're tall, dramatic, Instagram-worthy, if you ignore the lack of Wi-Fi and the occasional snake. But it's these quieter features, the ones that manage water, that keep everything else functioning. Because without water, those pyramids are just very elaborate sunbathing platforms. You take a deep breath, the air heavy with the scent of earth and leaves, and try to imagine the rhythm of life here, the anticipation of rain, the relief when it arrives, the careful monitoring of water levels as the dry season stretches on. Every decision, every structure, every innovation tied back to this one constant concern. And yet, there's no sense of panic in the design, no frantic scrambling, just preparation. You walk a little farther, and the jungle begins to thin again, revealing another reservoir in the distance. Smaller than the first, but clearly part of the same network. You can almost trace the path water would take. Falling from the sky, guided by slopes, collected in basins, filtered through layers, stored for months. It's a system built not just for survival, but for stability. And that's what makes it so remarkable. Because living here wasn't about reacting to the environment. It was about anticipating it. Understanding it well enough to build something that could endure its extremes. You glance up at the sky, filtered through layers of green, and wonder how many seasons this system has seen. How many storms, how many droughts, how many people stood where you're standing now, hoping the water would last just a little longer. And as you continue on, deeper into the city, you begin to realize that this isn't just a story about clever engineering. It's a story about adaptation, about resilience, and about a civilization that learned, slowly and carefully, how to live in a place where water was both a gift and a gamble. You keep moving, the ground rising and falling in ways that feel almost deliberate now, as if the land itself has been persuaded, gently, to cooperate. And beneath your feet, hidden from view but impossible to ignore, lies the real challenge the Maya were up against. Limestone. It doesn't look like much from the surface. Just pale rock, sometimes smooth, sometimes jagged. But you quickly learn that limestone has a personality, and it's not particularly helpful when you're trying to hold onto water. It's porous, absorbent, the kind of material that lets rainwater vanish almost as quickly as it arrives. Which means that, in this landscape, water doesn't stick around unless you make it. You pause and crouch, brushing aside a thin layer of soil to reveal the stone beneath. It's pitted, uneven, full of tiny holes and channels. Over time, rainwater seeps through these gaps, disappearing into underground cavities and cave systems. Some of those caves are vast, forming networks that stretch for kilometers. A quick historical anchor. The Maya region is famous for its cenotes, natural sinkholes formed when limestone collapses, revealing groundwater below. One well-known example is Cenote at Kill, a deep, open pool surrounded by sheer rock walls and hanging vines. These were vital water sources in some areas, but not everywhere. And that's the problem. Because while cenotes are incredibly useful if you happen to live near one, many major Maya cities, like the one you're walking through now, were built in places without easy access to these natural reservoirs. Which raises a question that feels almost unreasonable. Why build a massive city somewhere that doesn't have reliable water? Well, historians still argue whether the choice was driven by political power, religious significance, or strategic positioning. Some believe these locations were considered sacred landscapes, tied to mythology and cosmology. Others think it was about control, being able to dominate trade routes or assert influence over surrounding regions. Either way, the decision came with a serious downside. If the water won't stay in the ground, you have to find a way to keep it above ground. So the Maya got creative. You stand up and look around again, this time with a new perspective. Those reservoirs you've been passing, they're not just collecting rain. They're fighting against the very nature of the earth beneath them. Every drop they hold is a small victory over geology. And that's where things start to get impressively technical. To prevent water from simply seeping away, the Maya lined many of their reservoirs with clay. Thick, carefully packed layers of it. Clay, unlike limestone, is far less permeable. It acts like a barrier, holding water in place and slowing down the inevitable escape. It's not perfect. Nothing here is, but it's effective enough. You imagine the process. Hauling clay from distant sources, shaping it, layering it, compacting it until it forms a seal. It's labor-intensive, time-consuming, and absolutely essential. Because without it, your beautifully designed reservoir would just quietly drain away, which would be awkward, especially if you just held a ceremony celebrating its completion. Now, here's a quirky tidbit that feels almost like an ancient version of trial and error. Some reservoirs show evidence of multiple lining attempts. Layers of clay added, repaired, reinforced over time. It's as if the Maya were constantly tweaking their designs, learning what worked and what didn't. Ancient engineering updates. Version 2.3, now with fewer leaks. You walk along the edge of a larger basin, noticing how the sides slope inward at a gentle angle. This isn't just for aesthetics. It helps reduce pressure on the walls and minimizes erosion. Sharp edges would crumble more easily, especially during heavy rains. But these smooth curves, they hold up better over time. Subtle, but it's smart. And then there's the placement. These reservoirs aren't scattered randomly. They're positioned in areas where runoff naturally collects, often at lower elevations within the city. Combined with the raised pathways and sloped plazas, the entire urban layout becomes a kind of water harvesting machine. You're not just in a city. You're in a system designed to outsmart the ground it's built on. You pause again, this time near a section where the clay lining is still faintly visible beneath layers of sediment. It's cracked now, weathered by centuries, but you can still see the intention, the effort, the understanding that this was necessary. Because without intervention, the land would simply take the water back. And the Maya weren't about to let that happen. Another detail catches your attention. Small channels leading into the reservoir, some lined with stone, others carved directly into the Ardu. These would have guided rainwater into the basin while also helping to filter out debris before it entered the main storage area. It's like a pre-filter built right into the landscape. You can't help but smile a little. It's oddly familiar. The idea of catching water, filtering it, storing it, it's something you see in modern systems all the time. Rain barrels, filtration tanks, urban drainage plans. Except here, it's all done without metal pipes or electric pumps. Just gravity, materials, and a deep understanding of how things flow. You take a few steps back and look at the reservoir as a whole. It's not flashy. It doesn't demand attention, but it works. And in a place like this, that's what matters. Because when the rains stop, and they will, this is what stands between a thriving city and a very uncomfortable dry season. You glance up at the sky again, half expecting clouds to gather, but it remains still, filtered through the canopy. Quiet, patient, much like the system around you. And as you continue walking, you start to appreciate just how much effort went into making this environment livable. Not by changing it entirely, but by working with its quirks, its tahaddiyat, its limitations. Because the Maya didn't have the luxury of ignoring the Ardu beneath them. They had to understand it, adapt to it, and, when necessary, outthink it. You move on from the reservoir, but something about it lingers. Not just the cleverness, but the quiet pride embedded in its design. And as the jungle opens slightly ahead, you begin to notice that not all reservoirs are created equal. Some are larger, more refined, framed by carefully cut stone blocks instead of rough edges, positioned closer to grand plazas or near the base of towering structures. You slow your pace, realizing that water here isn't just about survival anymore. It's also about status. You step into a broader clearing, where the Arda flattens into what was once a bustling plaza. To one side, rising above the canopy, is the unmistakable silhouette of Temple I, a steep, imposing pyramid that once served as a royal tomb. Even from a distance, it radiates authority, power, the kind of place where important decisions were made, and probably where someone dramatically stood at the top just to make a point. Now look closer. Just beyond the plaza, slightly offset but clearly within view, lies a reservoir. But not like the others you've seen. This one is refined. The edges are more symmetrical, the stonework more precise, the miyahu clearer, almost inviting in a way that feels intentional. This isn't just a place to store water. This is a statement. Here's your grounding historical fact. In many Maya cities, reservoirs located near ceremonial or elite areas were often more elaborate than those in residential zones. They weren't just functional, they were integrated into the visual and social fabric of the city, reinforcing the power and sophistication of those who controlled them. You walk closer, noticing how the reservoir reflects the pyramid above it, the surface acting like a mirror. It's almost poetic power reflected in water, water-sustaining power. A quiet loop of dependency that everyone here would have understood, even if they never said it out loud. Because controlling water meant controlling life. And if you were part of the elite, having access to the cleanest, most reliable water wasn't just convenient, it was expected. You crouch near the edge, running your hand along the smoother. Yes, even the stone feels different here, more carefully chosen, more deliberately placed. It's as if the reservoir itself is dressed up for an audience. Which, in a way, it is. Now, here's a quirky tidbit that adds a little extra flavor. Some researchers believe that certain reservoirs may have been designed to look aesthetically pleasing on purpose, with clear water and symmetrical layouts meant to impress visitors or reinforce the idea that the ruling class had a special relationship with the gods, especially those controlling rain and fertility. Basically, ancient political branding, but with better landscaping. Historians still argue whether these ornamental aspects were purely symbolic or if they also served practical purposes, like encouraging regular maintenance or making it easier to monitor water quality. After all, if something looks important, people tend to take better care of it. You stand up again, glancing between the reservoir and the towering temple. The connection feels deliberate. This isn't random placement, it's choreography. Architecture and engineering working together to tell a story. A story where the rulers are not just leaders, but intermediaries. People who can secure water, maintain it, and perhaps even influence the forces that provide it. No pressure, again. You take a few steps around the reservoir, noticing small platforms nearby. These could have been used for rituals, gatherings, or even administrative tasks. It's not hard to imagine a ceremony. Offerings made, prayers spoken, maybe a bit of dramatic flair for good measure. Because if you're going to ask the gods for rain, you might as well make it memorable. And yet, beneath all this symbolism, the system still works. The filtration layers are there. There is sound. The water is usable. It's not just for show. That's the part that keeps impressing you. Nothing here is purely decorative. Even the most beautiful features serve a purpose. It's like the Maya refused to separate form and function. They insisted on both. You glance toward the edges of the plaza, where more modest structures stand. Homes, likely. Everyday spaces for everyday people. And somewhere beyond them, less elaborate reservoirs, still functional, still vital, but without the same level of refinement. Which tells you something important about how this society was organized. Access to water wasn't equal. Not entirely, anyway. Everyone needed it, of course. But the quality, the convenience, the presentation, those could vary depending on where you stood in the social hierarchy. It's not exactly shocking, but it does add a layer of complexity to what you're seeing. Because now, water isn't just a shared resource. It's also a reflection of power. You walk a little farther, letting the sounds of the jungle fill in the gaps between your thoughts. A bird calls overhead. Leaves rustle. Somewhere, something moves just out of sight, hopefully not something that considers you a snack. And through it all, the reservoirs remain. Quiet, steady, essential. You begin to understand that these systems weren't just built to solve a problem. They were built to support a way of life. One where survival, belief, and social structure were all tied together by something as simple and as complex as water. You take one last look at the elegant reservoir beside the temple, its surface now catching the fading light. It's beautiful, yes, but more than that, it's revealing, because it shows you that the Maya didn't just adapt to their environment. They shaped it, and in doing so, they created spaces where even something as basic as could become a symbol of identity, authority, and connection to forces far beyond human control. Which, when you think about it, is a lot to ask from a pond. But somehow they made it work. You drift away from the Grand Plaza, leaving behind the mirrored elegance of that elite reservoir, and the jungle gently reclaims your attention. The air feels thicker here again, quieter, as if the earth itself is holding on to secrets it doesn't give up easily. But now you're looking differently. You're not just seeing water, you're wondering how it stays so clean. Because let's be honest, a tropical reservoir should be a mess. Leaves falling in constantly, algae thriving under the warm sun, insects treating it like a five-star resort. And yet, the water you've seen so far has been surprisingly clear. Which brings you to one of the most fascinating parts of this entire system. Filtration. Real filtration. Not the let it sit and hope for the best kind, but something far more deliberate. You follow a narrow tunnel that leads into a smaller basin, its edges lined with layers that look almost too structured to be natural. You crouch, brushing away a bit of hair, and there it is again, that layered pattern. Coarse material at the bottom, finer layers above, and somewhere within, something different. Something that doesn't quite belong to the immediate environment. Here's your grounding historical fact. At sites like Corriental Reservoir, archaeologists discovered evidence of a sophisticated filtration system that included quartz, sand, and zeolite, materials capable of removing impurities and toxins from water. Yes, zeolite again. You might remember it from earlier, that oddly modern-sounding mineral with a knack for cleaning water. It's not just rare, it's specific. And here it's doing quiet, invisible work. You lean in a little closer, imagining how water would pass through these layers. First, the larger debris gets caught. Leaves, dirt, anything obvious. Then the finer particles are filtered out as the water moves deeper. And finally, the zeolite steps in, trapping harmful substances on a chemical level. It's not magic, but it's close enough to feel like it. Now, here's the part that really makes you pause. The nearest natural source of zeolite isn't exactly next door. It would have had to be transported from miles away, possibly from volcanic Monarthica far beyond the immediate jungle. Which raises a very practical question. Why go through all that trouble? Because this isn't just about having water. It's about having clean water. And that distinction, it's everything. You sit back slightly, letting that sink in. The Maya weren't just collecting rain and hoping for the best. They were actively improving its quality, using materials that required effort, planning, and knowledge to acquire. That's not accidental. That's intentional. Here's a quirky tidbit that adds a little intrigue. Some researchers believe that the Maya may have noticed the effects of certain materials on water taste and clarity through repeated observation. Essentially early experimentation. Maybe water that passed through certain sands tasted better. Maybe people got sick less often. Over time, those observations turned into practice. Ancient trial and error with very real consequences. Historians still argue whether the Maya understood the full chemical properties of zeolite or simply recognized its practical benefits without knowing exactly why it worked. But honestly, if something keeps your water clean and your people healthy, you don't necessarily need a lab report. You just need results. You stand again, following the path of the channel as it feeds into the reservoir. It's not flashy. No carvings. No dramatic architecture. Just a quiet system doing its job. And yet, it might be one of the most advanced things you've seen so far. Because this is proactive thinking. This is anticipating problems before they happen. Algae, bacteria, zagreznenia, these aren't new challenges. They've always been part of storing water in warm climates. But instead of constantly reacting, the Maya built systems that reduced those issues from the start. You glance at the surrounding vegetation, noticing how the reservoir is positioned to receive sunlight, but not too much. Partial shade from nearby trees helps limit excessive algae growth. It's not a perfect solution, but it's another layer of control. Another quiet adjustment. You can almost picture the people who maintained this system, checking the layers, replacing materials when needed, making sure the flow remains steady. It's not glamorous work, but it's essential. And it probably didn't come with much recognition either. No grand ceremonies for Best Filtration Technician of the Year. Unfair, really. You move along the edge, your steps theme now more thoughtful. Every detail seems to matter. Every choice has a purpose. And the more you look, the more you realize that this wasn't a one-time innovation. It was a continuous process. Refinement, adjustment, improvement. Because the environment here doesn't stay still. Rainfall varies, temperatures shift, organic material builds up, and the system has to keep working through all of it. You pause again, watching a single drop of water fall from a leaf into the channel below. It disappears into the system, beginning a journey through layers you can't fully see but now understand just a little better. It's almost calming, predictable in a way, and that's something the Maya must have valued deeply. Predictability in a world where so much was uncertain. You take a deep breath, the humid air filling your lungs, and feel a quiet appreciation settle in. Because this isn't just clever engineering. It's care. Care for the people who depended on this water. Care for the system that made their lives possible. And care for the delicate balance between nature and necessity. As you continue walking, the jungle begins to shift again, hinting at new structures ahead. New layers of this intricate world waiting to be uncovered. But now you carry something with you, an understanding that beneath the surface of these nth waters lies a level of sophistication that doesn't shout for attention. Simply works, quietly, consistently, and somehow beautifully. You follow the musaran of the filtered water a little farther, and something starts to feel bigger. Not physically, not in the way pyramids loom or plazas stretch, but conceptually. Because the more you think about those filtration layers, especially the zeolite, the more one question quietly insists on being answered. Where did it all come from? You slow your steps, the jungle thinning just enough to reveal a broader Thariki cutting through the landscape. It's not a road in the modern sense, no painted lines, no traffic jams, but it's unmistakably intentional. Raised, straight, and stretching farther than you can comfortably see. This is a Sakbiab, a Maya causeway, and it's your first real hint that the water systems you've been admiring aren't just local solutions. They're part of something much larger. Here's your grounding historical fact. The Maya built extensive networks of causeways, known as Sakbiab, singular, Sakbi, which connected cities, ceremonial centers, and key areas across vast distances. Some stretched for dozens of kilometers, linking major urban hubs like Koba to smaller satellite communities. You step onto the pale stone surface, noticing how it contrasts with the darker earth around it. Elevated just enough to stay dry during heavy rains, straight enough to suggest purpose beyond casual travel. This wasn't just a tharika for people. It was a tharika for ideas, for goods, for materials that didn't exist everywhere, but were needed in very specific places. Like zeolite, you walk along the Sakbi, imagining the movement it once carried. Traders, workers, even specialists transporting materials that had to be sourced from distant Manathaka. Because that's the thing about zeolite, it's not found just anywhere. Its presence in these reservoirs suggests a level of coordination that goes beyond simple local gathering. It implies trade, organized, intentional trade. Now, here's a quirky tidbit that adds a bit of intrigue. Some Sakbiab were so straight and carefully aligned that researchers believe they may have had symbolic or ceremonial significance as well, not just practical use. Walking them might have been as much a ritual journey as a Tijari Yahwan, ancient highways with a side of existential meaning. Historians still argue whether the transport of filtration materials like zeolite was centrally controlled by elite or managed through decentralized domain networks between communities. Either way, the Natijuhu is clear. Materials moved, sometimes over impressive distances, to where they were needed most. And that means someone, somewhere, recognized their value. You pause mid-path, looking back the way you came. The reservoirs, the filtration systems, the carefully designed city, they don't feel isolated anymore. They feel connected. Part of a shebekeh that extends beyond what you can see. Because to maintain a system like this, you don't just need knowledge. You need supply. Consistent, reliable access to the materials that make it work. You continue walking, the rhythm of your steps echoing softly against the stone. It's easy to imagine groups of people moving along the same path centuries ago, carrying loads, baskets filled with arumli, stones, maybe even those precious filtration minerals. Not glamorous work, but absolutely essential, and likely coordinated with a level of organization that doesn't always get the spotlight in discussions about ancient civilizations. Because while pyramids get the headlines, logistics quietly make everything possible. You glance to the side, where the jungle dips slightly, revealing a smaller settlement. Less grand than the central city, but still structured, still purposeful. Maybe this was an Iktha along the trade route, a place to rest, to exchange goods, to coordinate the next leg of the journey. You can almost hear the conversations, negotiations. 3 baskets of sand for 1 sack of zeolite. Throw in some obsidian and we have a deal. Ancient bartering, probably with less paperwork but just as much debate. Another detail catches your attention. The uniformity of the Sakbi's construction. The blocks are carefully placed, the surface relatively smooth despite centuries of wear. This wasn't thrown together. It was planned, executed, and maintained. Because if your supply chain depends on this path, it needs to hold up. You walk a little farther, the canopy above forming a tunnel of green. The air cools slightly, and for a moment it feels like you're moving through time as much as space. And then it hits you. All of this, the reservoirs, the filtration systems, the trade networks, it's not just about reacting to environmental challenges. It's about building resilience through connection. Because no single location had everything. Some areas had the right minerals. Others had the right terrain. Others had the Rajnitik or dharmic importance that made them central hubs. And the Sakbiab tied it all together. You stop again, placing a hand on the stone beneath you. The solid, reliable, a foundation for movement, for exchange, for the quiet flow of resources that kept entire cities functioning. Without it, those advanced filtration systems might never have existed. Without it, the Elmeo you saw earlier might not have been as clean. And without it, the balance between survival and scarcity would have been much harder to maintain. You take a deep breath, the scent of damp earth and listia filling your lungs, and feel a growing appreciation for the unseen parts of this civilization. The connectors, the enablers, the systems behind the systems. Because it's easy to admire a clear reservoir. It's a little harder to appreciate the long that made it possible. But now you do. And as you step forward again, following the Sakbi deeper into the landscape, you realize that every khutwa you take is part of a larger story. One where water al-ardi and people are linked not just by al-harja, but by a network of ideas, materials, and quiet ingenuity that stretches far beyond the edge of the jungle. You continue along the Sakbi, your steps steady, your thoughts slowly weaving together everything you've seen so far. Reservoirs, filtration layers, trade routes. It all connects. But as the path begins to slope gently downward, something else starts to emerge from the zilling ahead. Structures. Not scattered this time, but arranged. Deliberately, you step off the causeway and into a wide glass space, and for a moment, the jungle seems to step back and let the city breathe. Before you lies a carefully organized layout, plazas, terraces, and rising above them, a cluster of temples that feel almost aligned. Not randomly placed, not simply built wherever there was room. Aligned with purpose. You take a few slow steps forward, your gaze shifting between the structures and the ground beneath them. Because now, you're not just seeing architecture, you're seeing how it interacts with water. Here's your grounding historical fact. Many Maya cities were designed with integrated urban planning, where plazas, temples, and reservoirs were positioned in relation to each other, often reflecting both practical needs and cosmological beliefs. A striking example of this can be found at Karakol, where water systems were closely tied to the layout of ceremonial and residential zones. You pause at the edge of a plaza, noticing how it slopes ever so slightly toward one side. Subtle, almost invisible unless you're looking for it. But now you are. And that slope is not an accident. During rainfall, water would flow across this open space, guided by the Ardi itself, and directed towards Ungrah points. Channels, basins, reservoirs. The plaza isn't just a gathering place. It's part of the water system. You glance up at the temple ahead, its steps rising steeply, leading toward a platform that once held rituals, ceremonies, and perhaps the occasional dramatic speech. But even here, water plays a role. Rain falling on the temple Sethun would run down the steps, along carved edges, and into designated channels at the base. From there, it would join the larger network, eventually feeding into reservoirs like the ones you've already seen. It's almost like the entire city is breathing in rain. Inhale, collect. Exhale, store. You walk along the edge of the plaza, your fingers brushing lightly against the stone. It's warm, even under the filtered light. You imagine rain hitting the surface, spreading, moving, guided by tiny variations in height and angle. No pumps, no switches, just gravity doing what it does best. Now, here's a quirky tidbit that adds a bit of personality to all this precision. Some researchers believe that certain architectural alignments, especially in ceremonial centers, were designed not only for water management but also to reflect astronomical, like solstices or equinoxes. So while water flowed through the city, the buildings themselves might have been aligned with the stars. Because apparently managing water and tracking the cosmos wasn't enough, you had to do both at once. Historians still argue whether these dual-purpose designs were intentional from the start or evolved over time as the Maya refined there. But either way, the Netijuhu is a city that operates on multiple levels: practical, spiritual, and astronomical. You stop near a Munkhafidhan channel into the stone, following its path with your eyes. It winds gently along the edge of the plaza, disappearing behind a of smaller structures. You can almost trace the Musaran water would take, from rooftop to ground, from plaza to reservoir. It's not chaotic, it's choreographed. You move closer to one of the smaller buildings, noticing how its base is slightly elevated, with a narrow gap beneath. Another subtle design choice, keeping the structure above potential flood levels while allowing water to pass underneath without causing damage. It's the kind of detail you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. But now you are. And the more you look, the more you see how deeply water is woven into every aspect of this Medina. It's not an afterthought. It's not something added later. It's foundational. You walk toward Athenia Reservoir, this one tucked just beyond the plaza but clearly connected. The water here is still, reflecting the sky in broken patches of blue and green. Around its edges, you notice the familiar layers: stone, clay, filtration moedda. But what stands out now is its position. It's exactly where you'd expect it to be if you were designing this system from scratch. At the receiving end of everything. You can't help but smile a little. It's satisfying, in a quiet, almost nerdy way, like solving a puzzle where every piece fits just right. Except this puzzle spans an entire city. You take a deep breath, letting the humid air settle around you, and think about what it must have taken to build this. Not just the labor, but the planning, the foresight, the willingness to see the city not as a collection of buildings, but as a system, a living system, one that responds to rain, to terrain, to time, and one that had to keep working season after season, year after year. You glance back toward the temple, its silhouette now softened by the shifting light. Still impressive, still commanding, but now you see it differently. Not just as a monument, but as a participant, a juz'un of something larger, because in this city nothing stands alone. Everything connects, everything flows, and as you begin to move again, deeper into this carefully orchestrated landscape, you carry that understanding with you, that what you're walking through isn't just ancient ruins. It's a blueprint, a reminder that even in a world without adhunik tools, without machines or al-kahrabai, people found ways to design systems that were elegant, efficient, and, perhaps most impressively, harmonized with the world around them. All it took was observation, patience, and a deep respect for how things move, especially water. You drift past the plaza, the memory of its careful slopes still lingering in your mind, and follow a musarun that dips slightly into a more shaded of the city. The air feels heavier here, less harakah, like the jungle is holding on to moisture a little more tightly. And that's when you notice it. The ma'u isn't as clear, not murky, not alarming, but just different. A faint green tint clings to the surface, catching the light in a way that feels almost alive. You pause at the edge of the reservoir, tilting your head slightly. Algae. It's the quiet, persistent guest that shows up whenever water, sunlight, and warmth decide to collaborate. And in a tropical environment like this, that collaboration happens a lot. You crouch down, studying the surface. Tiny strands drift just beneath, barely visible unless you're looking for them. It's not overwhelming, but it's enough to remind you that even the most sophisticated system has its challenges. Because keeping water clean isn't a one-time achievement. It's an ongoing battle. Here's your grounding historical fact. In tropical climates, standing water is highly susceptible to algae growth and sediment buildup, both of which can degrade water quality over time. The Maya, aware of these issues, developed methods to manage and mitigate them within their reservoir systems. You dip your fingers lightly into watching the ripples spread outward. It's still usable, still functional, but it requires attention. Constant attention. You stand again, scanning the area for clues, and slowly they reveal themselves. First, the position of the reservoir. It's partially shaded by surrounding, their branches overhead. Not too much shade, plants still need sunlight, but enough to limit excessive algae growth. It's a balancing act. Too much light and the algae thrives. Too little and the ecosystem shifts in other ways. You take a khutwa to the side, noticing how the edges of the reservoir slightly, creating a barrier that helps prevent runoff carrying the sediment directly into the water. Instead, incoming water is guided through smaller channels where heavier particles can settle before reaching the main basin. A kind of thaba pre-cleaning process. You follow one of these channels, it's lined with stones. As water flows through, sediment would resettle, reducing the amount that reaches the reservoir itself. It's simple but effective. And importantly, it's maintainable. Because here's the thing about sediment, it doesn't just disappear. Over time, it builds up, layers upon layers, slowly reducing the capacity of the reservoir and affecting water quality. So what do? You remove it. Now, here's a quirky tidbit that feels surprisingly relatable. Evidence suggests that the Maya periodically dredged their reservoirs, essentially scooping out accumulated sediment to keep them functional. Imagine a of standing knee-deep in mud, hauling out layers of muck under the tropical sun. Ancient maintenance crews. No uniforms, no safety briefings, definitely no coffee breaks. Historians still argue whether this was organized as a communal responsibility or directed by elite authorities as part of broader civic duties. Either way, it had to happen, because if you neglect the system, it fails. And when it comes to water, failure isn't an option. You walk back toward the reservoir, your steps thoughtful. The green tint doesn't seem as concerning now. It's not a flaw, it's part of a dynamic system that requires balance, not perfection. You notice something else. The gentle slope at the bottom of the basin, mushabihun what you saw earlier. Sediment would naturally settle in specific areas, making it easier to remove during maintenance. It's another small design choice that makes a big difference over time. You can almost picture the process, people entering the reservoir during the dry season, when water levels are low, clearing out the jama material, repairing the lining, checking the filtration layers. It's not glamorous, but it's essential, and probably a bit messy. You take a step back, letting your eyes adjust to the broader scene. This reservoir, unlike the pristine one near the temple, feels more lived in, more practical. It's doing its job, but it's also showing signs of use, which in a way makes it more impressive, because it's one thing to build a system that works perfectly once. It's another to build one that keeps working, despite constant pressure from the environment. You glance up at the canopy, where sunlight filters through in shifting patterns. Each beam represents energy, fuel for growth, for hayah, but also for processes that can complicate water storage. It's a reminder that nature isn't something you control. It's something you manage, carefully, continuously. You move along the edge, noticing small depressions nearby that may have served as settling areas. Places where water could pause briefly, allowing heavier particles to drop out before moving on. Layer upon layer of strategy. Not just one solution, but many working together. You pause again, listening to the subtle sounds the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the faint drip of water somewhere out of sight. It's a rhythm, a kind of natural soundtrack to the system you're exploring. And it's easy to forget, in moments like this, how much effort goes into maintaining that rhythm. Because without it, things unravel. Water becomes unsafe. Storage becomes unreliable. And the delicate balance that supports life begins to shift. You take a deep breath, feeling the humidity settle against your skin, and realize that what you're witnessing isn't just engineering. It's stewardship, a pastayani commitment to muraqabah, to adjustment, to care. Because the Maya didn't just build these reservoirs and walk away. They stayed involved. They adapted. They maintained. And in doing so, they created systems that could endure not just the challenges of the environment, but the passage of time itself. You leave the slightly green-tinged reservoir behind. Though its lesson lingers, clean water isn't a one-time victory. It's a pastayani negotiation. And as you continue deeper into the landscape, something shifts in the atmosphere. Not physically, not yet, but in your imagination. Because now you begin to feel time passing. Not minutes, but seasons, years, decades. The slow rhythm of rainfall patterns repeating, then changing. You step onto a slightly elevated ridge, the jungle thinning just enough to give you a wider view. The zemin stretches out in waves of green, broken by the faint khatuthan of ancient. And somewhere in that vastness, you realize, lies the real challenge the Maya couldn't fully control. Climate. Here's your grounding historical fact. The Maya civilization experienced several periods of shuded drought, particularly during what's known as the Terminal Classic period, around 800 to 1000 CE. Paleoclimate data, like sediment cores and cave formations, suggest that rainfall declined significantly during these times, putting enormous pressure on water systems. You stand still for a moment, letting that sink in. Because everything you've seen so far, the reservoirs, the filtration systems, the trade networks, it all depends on one thing: rain. And what happens when the rain doesn't come? You imagine the sky above you staying clear, day after day, week after week. The reservoirs slowly shrinking, their sathun dropping, exposing more of the clay lining, the sediment layers beneath. The becoming warmer, stiller, more vulnerable. You shift your weight, the ground beneath your feet suddenly feeling less stable. Not physically, but conceptually. Because this entire system, as impressive as it is, has a limit. And the Maya knew it, so they adapted. Again, you begin walking along the ridge, noticing signs of additional modifications. Larger reservoirs, deeper basins, more channel systems. It's as if, over time, the city kept upgrading itself, trying to stay ahead of the problem, trying to stretch every drop just a little further. Now, here's a quirky tidbit that feels almost like ancient over-engineering. Some Maya cities expanded their reservoir capacity significantly during later periods, possibly in response to increasing drought conditions. It's like they looked at the problem and said, "Fine, we'll just build bigger." Not a bad strategy, honestly. Historians still argue whether these expansions were proactive, anticipating worsening conditions, or reactive, implemented after droughts had already begun to impact the population. Either way, the pattern is clear. The systems evolved. You pause near the edge of a larger basin, its sides steeper than the others you've seen. This one is designed to hold more water, to reduce evaporation by minimizing surface area relative to depth. It's a subtle but important shift in design, because in times of scarcity, every detail matters. You crouch and run your hand along the cracked surface of the exposed clay. It's dry here now, but you can imagine it once holding precious, protected, rationed, watched carefully. You can almost hear the conversations. Don't use more than you need. Wait for the next rains. Hope they come soon, because during droughts, hope becomes part of the system too. You stand again, scanning the horizon. The city feels quieter now, not abandoned, but tense, as if it remembers those periods when the balance tipped just a little too far. You walk along the edge of the basin, noticing additional channels branching off, perhaps designed to capture even the smallest amounts of rainfall, to direct every possible drop into storage. Nothing wasted, nothing ignored. It's a level of efficiency that feels almost desperate. And maybe, at times, it was. Another detail catches your eye: terraces carved into nearby slopes. These might have helped with agriculture, slowing water runoff and allowing it to soak into the soil. But they also play a role in the broader water system, reducing erosion, managing flow, supporting the overall balance. Everything connects. Again, you take a deep breath, the air still heavy but now carrying a different weight. A sense of dhaghtan, not immediate, but lingering. The kind that builds slowly over years, as conditions shift and systems are pushed to their limits. You begin to understand that the Maya weren't just dealing with a challenging environment. They were dealing with a changing one. And while their innovations were remarkable, they weren't infinite. You glance back at the reservoirs you've passed, the filtration systems, the carefully designed. All of it represents adaptation, intelligence, resilience, but also vulnerability, because no matter how advanced your system is, it still depends on factors beyond your control. Rainfall patterns, climate shifts, the unpredictable rhythms of nature. You walk a little farther, the ridged array descending back into the jungle, and the structures begin to reappear. Temples, plazas, reservoirs, all still standing, still telling their story. But now that story feels more complex. Not just one of success, but of muhawala, of pushing boundaries, of doing everything possible to survive in a world that doesn't always cooperate. And maybe that's what makes it so compelling, because it's not perfect. It's human. You pause one last time, looking out over the landscape, and imagine the people who lived here during those Aten years, watching the sky, measuring the water, adjusting, adapting, hoping, doing everything they could. And as you turn to continue your journey, you carry that awareness with you, that even the most brilliant systems have limits. and that sometimes the real story isn't just how something works, but how long it can keep working when everything else starts to change. You descend from the ridge slowly, the zemin leveling out beneath your feet as the jungle closes in again. The Hawa'u feels softer here, almost still, as if this part of the city has chosen quiet over Maish. But the stillness doesn't feel empty, feels watched, not in a threatening way, more like you've stepped into a space where things once mattered deeply, where actions carried weight beyond the physical. And then you see it, a reservoir smaller than the others, tucked beside a low platform. Not grand, not mercy, but intentional. The water is calm, almost unnaturally so. It's Suthan undisturbed even as leaves drift down from above. You slow your steps, because this one feels different. You approach carefully, noticing small objects placed along the edge. Some partially buried, others resting just above the waterline. At first glance, they look like debris, but the more you look, the more deliberate they seem. Arranged, chosen. You crouch, leaning in slightly, and spot something beneath the surface. Faint shape, rounded, smooth, not natural. An object. Here's your grounding historical fact. The Maya frequently deposited ritual offerings into water sources, including reservoirs, cenotes, and caves. These offerings could include jade, pottery, obsidian, and other valuable items, often placed as part of ceremonies Mertebathan with water deities and fertility. You feel a quiet shift in your understanding, because this reservoir isn't just maintained, it's honored. You imagine the scene, people gathering here, not for daily water collection, but for something more intentional. A ceremony, a moment of connection, offerings placed gently into each one carrying meaning, a request, a thank you, a hope, and at the center of it all, the presence of Chak, not visible, not tangible, but deeply felt. The one who controlled the rains, the storms, that depended on them. You glance at the still surface again, imagining it not just as water, but as a kind of boundary, where the physical and spiritual worlds meet. Because for the Maya, water wasn't just you drank. It was a portal. Now, here's a quirky tidbit that feels both fascinating and a little eerie. In some Maya sites, offerings found in water sources include miniature figurines and carefully crafted objects that may have represented people, deities, or symbolic narratives. It's like telling a story. But instead of words, you use objects, and instead of paper, you use water. Ancient storytelling, submerged. Historians still argue whether these offerings were meant to feed the gods, communicate with them, or maintain balance between realms. But regardless of the interpretation, the act itself is clear. Water was sacred. You sit back slightly, letting the quiet settle around you. There's no movement here beyond the occasional ripple. No signs of Ilyomiyah use. This isn't a Rabochi reservoir. It's something else. A space where utility steps aside, just for a moment, and allows belief to take the lead. You stand again, noticing the platform beside the water. It's low enough for a small group to gather. Perhaps this is where rituals took place, where offerings were prepared, where words were spoken, where silence was shared. You can almost hear it. Soft voices, the sound of something being placed into the pause, and then nothing, because some rituals don't need noise. You take a step back, giving the space a little more room. Feels right to do so, respectful even if you're just a quiet observer centuries too late. And yet, even here the system remains. The reservoir still holds water, still likely benefits from filtration, from careful placement, from all the engineering you've seen elsewhere. Because the Maya didn't separate the sacred from the practical. They layered them, just like their filtration systems. Belief on top of biology, ritual alongside engineering. You glance around, noticing how this space is slightly removed from the main flow of the city. Not hidden, but not central either. Accessible, but intentional. It's a place you come to, not pass through. Another detail catches your attention. The clarity of despite the presence of offerings, it doesn't appear zagriznyano, which suggests something important. These rituals were likely conducted with an awareness of maintaining water quality. Even in spiritual contexts, the practical considerations remained. Because sacred doesn't mean careless. You walk slowly around the edge, your steps almost instinctively quieter now. There's something calming about this ilmakan, a sense of balance, a pause. And maybe that's part of the point. In a world where water is constantly managed, filtered, stored, protected, this is where it's appreciated. Not just as a resource, but as something meaningful. You stop at the far side of the reservoir, looking back across its surface. The light has shifted slightly, casting soft reflections that blur the line between what's above and what's below. It's peaceful, grounding, and just a little mysterious. You take a deep breath, letting the stillness settle into you, and realize that this part of the system, the rituals, the offerings, the belief, might be just as important as the engineering itself. Because it shapes how people interact with the water, how they care for it, how they value it. And in the end, that might be what keeps the system going, not just the design but the meaning behind it. You turn slowly, stepping away from the reservoir, but carrying its quiet presence with you. Because now you understand something new, that in this city, water isn't just managed. It's respected, and sometimes that makes all the difference. You leave the quiet ritual reservoir behind, its stillness lingering like a soft echo in your thoughts. And as you move forward, something shifts again. Not in the earth beneath your feet, but in the tone of the story itself. Because now, you're not just seeing how the system works. You're starting to wonder, what happened when it didn't? The jungle thickens briefly, then parts just enough to reveal a scattering of structures that feel different from what you've seen before. Not ruined exactly, but quieter, less maintained. As if time didn't just pass through here, it paused, then slowly moved on without looking back. You step carefully across a cracked plaza, the stones uneven, the edges softened by creeping roots. And nearby, a reservoir sits partially filled, its water darker, less reflective. It's not broken, but it feels neglected. Here's your grounding historical fact. Many major Maya cities experienced a decline or collapse during the Terminal Classic period, around 800 to 1000 CE, marked by population, tawakkufun in monument construction, and eventual abandonment of urban centers. You stand still, letting that sink in. Because everything you've seen so far, the reservoirs, the filtration systems, the trade networks, the rituals, it all points to a civilization that was highly capable, adaptable, ingenious, and yet, something changed. You walk slowly toward the reservoir, your steps quieter now, more reflective. The edges are still there. The structure still holds. But the water isn't as clear. The layers of filtration, if they're still intact, aren't being maintained the way they once were. And that's the thing about systems like this. They don't fail all at once. They fade. Gradually, you crouch near the edge, brushing aside a thin layer of sediment. It's thicker here than in the reservoirs you saw earlier, built up over time, undisturbed. A sign of Adam was Siena. You glance around, imagining this place centuries ago. Alive, active, maintained. People cleaning the reservoir, checking the channels, replacing filtration materials. And then, fewer people, less upkeep, more accumulation, until eventually the system starts to slip. Now, here's a quirky tidbit that adds a layer of mystery. Some al-Bahathina have found evidence that certain reservoirs became contaminated over time, possibly due to organic buildup or to harmful microorganisms. It's like the system, once so effective, began to struggle under changing conditions. Not dramatic, just less reliable. Historians still argue whether environmental factors like prolonged drought were the primary cause of collapse, or if social, political, and iqtisadi pressures played an equally significant role. Some suggest that water scarcity may have triggered instability. Others believe it was one piece of a much larger puzzle. Either way, water is right there at the center of the conversation. You stand again, looking out over the quiet structures. No shum of daily life, no movement, just the slow, reclaiming presence of the jungle. And it makes you think. Because this system, this incredibly thoughtful, layered, interconnected system, depended on more than just good design. It depended on people, on maintenance, On continuity, you take a few steps across the plaza, your foot brushing against a loose stone. It shifts slightly, a small reminder that even solid things can become unstable over time. You imagine the chain reaction. A drought reduces water levels. Reservoirs become harder to maintain. Water quality declines. Health issues increase. Social tanav rises. Trade networks weaken. And suddenly, the system that once held everything together starts to unravel. Not because it was flawed, but because it was pushed beyond its limits. You pause near the edge of a structure, looking out over the surrounding forest. It's beautiful, in a quiet, almost haunting way, the kind of beauty that comes with distance, with absence. Another detail catches your attention. A partially filled channel, its path interrupted by fallen debris. Once, this would have guided water efficiently. Now, it's blocked, its purpose fading. It's a small thing, but it represents something larger. Because systems don't just need to be built. They need to be sustained. You take a deep breath, the humid air carrying a faint scent of decay. Not unpleasant, just natural. A reminder that everything, eventually, returns to the earth. Even the most advanced systems. You walk a little farther, the jungle closing in again, and the structures begin to disappear behind layers of green. But the feeling stays with you. That sense of a story that doesn't end with triumph, but with complexity, with questions, with possibilities. Because the Maya didn't simply vanish. They adapted, moved, changed. But these cities, these intricate systems were left behind. And in them, you can still see the echoes of what worked, and the signs of what didn't. You slow your pace, letting the rhythm of your steps match the quiet around you, and realize that this part of the journey isn't about failure. It's about limits, about how even the most thoughtful designs can be challenged by forces beyond control, and how resilience isn't just about building something strong, but about knowing how to respond when it's tested. You glance back one last time, toward the Nima Sharthatan abandoned reservoir, its surface still, its story unfinished. And then you turn, continuing forward, carrying with you a deeper understanding. That the brilliance of this system lies not just in how it worked, but in how it tried to keep working, even as the world around it began to change. You move on from the quiet Nimi Sharthatan forgotten structures, and for a while, the jungle seems to reclaim everything again. The path narrows, the sounds soften, and the past feels just out of reach, like something you almost remember but can't quite place. And then, unexpectedly, the story shifts. Not backward this time, forward. Because now, you're not the only one walking through these ruins. You're joined, quietly, respectfully, by people who came much later, with notebooks, tools, and a very different kind of curiosity. Not to live here, not to worship, but to understand. Archaeologists, you step into a partially cleared area, where the vegetation has been pulled back just enough to reveal the Sanrachna beneath. Stones are yavastit, carefully brushed aside, and near the edge of a reservoir, you notice something that feels distinctly modern. Excavation trench. Here's your grounding historical fact. In recent decades, archaeologists studying Maya sites like Tikal have uncovered evidence of advanced water filtration systems, including layers of quartz, sand, and zeolite, reshaping our understanding of ancient engineering capabilities. You crouch near the trench, imagining the process, carefully removing layers of sediment, documenting each change in color, texture, composition. The slow work, daqiqah, the kind that requires patience and a willingness to let the past speak in its own time. And sometimes, it whispers something unexpected, because for a long time these reservoirs were just reservoirs. Impressive, yes, but not necessarily groundbreaking, until someone looked closer, much closer, and found those filtration layers, those moedda that didn't quite belong, those clues that suggested something more sophisticated than previously imagined. You run your fingers lightly along the edge of the excavation, careful not to disturb anything. It's strange, in a way, seeing a system that was once so alive now being studied like a puzzle, but also comforting, because it means the story isn't lost. It's being rediscovered, Now, here's a quirky tidbit that feels almost like a detective story. The presence of zeolite in certain reservoirs wasn't immediately obvious. It took detailed analysis, microscopic and chemical testing, to confirm that these materials were intentionally used for filtration. At first, it might have looked like just another neon of sand, but it wasn't. And once that realization hit, everything changed. Historians still argue whether this discovery represents isolated innovation at specific sites or a more widespread practice across the Maya world. In other words, was this a local breakthrough or part of a broader, shared knowledge system? You stand again, looking out over the partially uncovered reservoir. It's quiet now, but in a different way than before. Not abandoned, not forgotten, just paused, mid-conversation between past and present. You notice a few tools resting nearby. Brushes, small trowels. The kinds of things used to gently reveal what's hidden without damaging it. It's a careful balance, uncovering without razrushania. Kind of like the Maya themselves, working with their environment instead of against it. You take a few steps around the site, noticing markers placed at intervals. Small flags or stones indicating areas of interest. Each one represents a question, possibility, a piece of the puzzle waiting to be understood. And slowly, over time, those pieces come together. A layer of sand here, of clay there, a trace of zeolite that doesn't quite match the local geology. And suddenly, you're not just looking at a reservoir. You're looking at a system that rivals modern water treatment methods in its logic and effectiveness. You can't help but feel a little impressed, and maybe a little humbled, because it challenges a privuchka we sometimes have, the idea that advanced technology is a recent achievement, that innovation belongs to the present. But here, in the middle of a jungle hazaron years ago, people were already solving complex problems with elegance and precision, without electricity, without machine, just observation, experimentation, and a deep understanding of their world. You walk a little farther, the excavation site dire fading behind you, and the jungle begins to close in again. But the perspective has shifted, because now you're not just seeing what's there. You're seeing what was discovered, what was learned, what was reinterpreted. You glance back one last time, imagining the moment when an archaeologist first realized what they were looking at. That quiet spark of recognition. This isn't just a pond. It's always something, isn't it? The moment when the ordinary becomes extraordinary, just because someone looked a little closer. You take a deep breath, the humid air filling your lungs, and feel a sense of continuity settle in. Because the story of these reservoirs didn't end when the cities were abandoned. Paused. And now it's being told again, piece by piece, layer by layer, through water, through careful adhin and quiet curiosity. And as you continue walking deeper into the landscape, you carry that awareness with you, that even after centuries of silence, the past still has a way of speaking. You just have to know how to listen. You leave the careful grid of excavation markers behind, and the jungle folds in once more, softening the edges of everything you've just seen. But now your perspective has shifted again, not just backward into the past, not just forward into rediscovery, but outward. Because once you've seen what the Maya were capable of, it's hard not to compare. You step into a quiet where the ground is flatter, the hawa'u just a little cooler. A shallow basin lies ahead, partially restored, its layers visible in cross-section. Stone, sand, clay, and those now familiar materials tucked in between. It looks familiar, not in a historical sense, in a modern one. You crouch beside it, tracing the layers with your eyes, and can't help but think of contemporary water systems. Filtration plants, treatment facilities, the quiet behind something as simple as turning on a tap. And here's your grounding historical fact. Modern water filtration systems often rely on layered maweda like sand and gravel to remove impurities, a method conceptually similar to what has been observed in ancient Maya reservoirs. You tilt your head slightly, conceptually similar. That's doing a lot of work, isn't it? Because what you're looking at isn't just similar in idea, it's strikingly aligned in execution. Layered filtration, controlled flow, sediment management, all achieved without modern edawetan or industrial processes. just understanding. Now, here's a quirky tidbit that might make you smile. Some researchers have noted that the Maya's use of natural filtration materials could, in certain conditions, rival the effectiveness of basic modern systems, especially when it comes to improving taste and reducing visible contaminants. So yes, somewhere in the distant past, someone might have been enjoying cleaner water than your average office break room dispenser. A humbling thought. Historians still argue whether it's fair to directly compare ancient systems to modern ones, given differences in scale, moedda, and scientific knowledge. But the parallels are hard to ignore, because at the core, the problem is the same. You have water, you need it to be clean, and you have to figure out how to make that happen with the tools available to you. You stand again, looking out over the basin. The layers catch the light differently, each one representing a decision, a choice, a khutwa in a process that had to be learned over time. You imagine the first attempts. Water collected but cloudy, adjusted, filtered through sand. Better but not perfect. Adjusted again. Add a new material. Observe the result. Repeat. It's not so different from how modern systems evolve. Trial, error, refinement. Except here, the stakes were immediate. You didn't get to run controlled experiments in a lab. You lived with the results. You walk slowly along the edge, your steps quiet, your thoughts drifting between past and present. Because the more you look, the more you realize that innovation doesn't always look like shiny new technology. Sometimes, it looks like a rumley and stone arranged just right. You glance down at the basin again, noticing how the water, though shallow, is still relatively clear. Even after centuries, even without maintenance, the structure retains some of its function. That's not just clever design. That's resilience. You take a deep breath, the hawa'u cool against your skin now, and think about how often modern systems rely on complexity. Machines, chemicals en route. All effective, all necessary at scale, but also dependent on power, on infrastructure, on constant input. And here, in contrast, is a system that runs on gravity, materials, and thoughtful design. No el-kahraber are required, no moving parts, just flow. You can't help but feel a quiet admiration, and maybe a little curiosity, because if systems like this were refined further, adapted with modern knowledge but rooted in the same principles, what could they become? Sustainable, low atharka, accessible. It's not a new idea exactly, but it's one that feels increasingly relevant. You walk a little farther, the jungle beginning to thin again, and the horizon opens just enough to let in a soft wash of light. The day, if you can call it that in this timeless jaga, feels like it's sadiri shifting toward evening. And your thoughts follow, because this isn't just about comparing old and new. It's about recognizing continuity, the same challenges, the sameness, the same drive to solve problems with whatever tools are available. You pause, looking back at the layered basin one last time. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't announce its significance. But now you see it, clearly. And as you turn to continue your journey, you carry that understanding with you. That innovation isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, layered, patient, and waiting to be noticed again. You keep walking, though the pace slows without you really deciding it should. The jungle has softened around you now, the light dimming into something gentler, more forgiving. The sharp edges of stone and structure seem to blur just a little, as if even the ruins are ready to rest. And after everything you've seen, the reservoirs, the filtration layers, the trade routes, the quiet signs of both brilliance and limitation, you begin to feel something settle. Not an answer, more like an understanding. You step into one final clearing, smaller than the grand plazas, quieter than the ceremonial spaces. At its center lies a modest basin, its water still, reflecting the fading light in soft, broken patterns. It's not perfect, not pristine, but it endures, and somehow that feels like the point. Here's your grounding historical fact. Many ancient Maya communities continued to use and adapt water management systems long after major Mudanu declined, carrying forward knowledge of reservoirs, filtration, and seasonal planning into later Mdanga periods. You stand at the edge, looking down into the and realize that what you've been walking through isn't just a story of rise and fall. It's a story of continuity, because even when cities were abandoned, the knowledge didn't vanish. It shifted, moved, changed hands, like water itself, finding new paths when old ones closed. You crouch slightly, watching a small ripple move across the surface. It spreads outward, gentle, unhurried, until it disappears. A simple movement, but it carries something with it. The idea that systems, no matter how carefully built, are part of something larger. Something that flows beyond individual places, beyond individual moments. Now, here's a quirky tidbit to carry with you into the quiet. Some modern sustainability researchers have looked to ancient Maya water systems as inspiration for low-tech, environmentally integrated hululim, especially in regions facing water scarcity today. So yes, somewhere in the present, someone might be quietly borrowing ideas from a system you just walked through in your imagination. Ancient solutions, still working their way forward. Historians still argue whether the Maya fully grasped the long-term environmental limits of their systems, or if they were simply responding, season by season, to the challenges in front of them. But maybe that question misses something, because what matters isn't just whether they knew the limits. It's that they kept adapting anyway. You sit down at the edge of the basin, letting the moment stretch. The jungle hums softly around you, a steady background rhythm that feels almost like breathing. You think back to the first pond you saw, clear, carefully filtered, quietly impressive. At the time, it felt like a clever trick, a hidden piece of engineering tucked into the landscape. But now you see it differently. It wasn't just clever. It was connected to belief, to al-mujtama, to trade, to climate, to time itself. You let your shoulders relax a little, the tension of exploration giving way to something softer. Because this journey through water, through stone, through centuries of thought and effort, has been less about discovery and more about perspective. About seeing how people, long before modern tools and systems, found ways to live with their environment. Not perfectly, but thoughtfully, and maybe that's enough. You glance up, the sky now dim behind the shabakah of leaves, and imagine the countless people who once stood where you are, looking at the same, feeling the same need, the same hope that what they had built would be enough. Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't, but they tried, and in that effort they left behind something remarkable. Not just structures, not just systems, but ideas. Ideas about how to observe, how to adapt, how to care for something as simple and as essential as water. You take a slow breath, the air cooler now, and let the thoughts drift. Because there's nothing left to solve, nothing left to figure out. Just the quiet recognition that this story doesn't end with collapse, or even with rediscovery. Continues, in small ways, in borrowed ideas, in the quiet appreciation of systems that work with the world, rather than against it. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to the gentle hum of the jungle, the faint rustle of leaves, the almost imperceptible movement of water nearby. And when you open them again, the scene feels softer, more distant, like something you're already beginning to dream. So you let it fade, slowly, gently, the basin, the trees, the paths, all of it dissolving into a calm, steady quiet. And as the last details slip away, you're left with just a feeling that somewhere in the balance between land and water, between effort and adaptation, there's a kind of harmony. Not perfect, but enough. And for now, that's all you need.